All right. So kind of where we were coming out of last week was Young Earth Creationism. So we kind of discovered that. We kind of had like a kind of a flow chart that showed the different views on origin of creation, right? So we, first one was like naturalistic evolution, which is kind of like where atheists are, and then we had the next one, which is intelligent design, right? So intelligent design doesn't actually necessarily mean that you believe in the Christian God or the Jewish God, or the one true God. It means that you believe that there was some sort of intelligent agent that created the universe, right? And then you move on from there to theistic evolution, which kind of, you believe in God, but you also believe that it was done through evolution, right? Evolution actually was the process that God used in order to create everything. And then thirdly, where does it go from there? I think that's where it then bifurcates, and then we split into Old Earth and Young Earth Creationism, right? So if you believe that the Earth is less than 10,000 years old, you would be called a Young Earth Creationist. And then we kind of went through all like their kinds of evidence and why they hold that view last week. And then there's Old Earth Creationism too, which we're going to talk about today, which is the belief that God did take a long... Oh, is there a Bible in here? I don't see one. So Old Earth Creationism holds that the Earth and universe is actually very old, which is the scientific consensus, right? So, and when God talks about there being different days in Genesis, they're actually more like ages, right? So it's not a single 24-hour day. It could be millions or even potentially billions of years that each day happened over. And so we're just going to kind of show. So if you want to know more about the Young Earth view, we're actually going to be talking about it today because we're going to spend a lot of today going over what scientists have to say. How do they date the Earth? How do they date the universe? And how would a young Earther respond to that? What's their evidence that maybe it's not the way that the scientists think it is? Because an Old Earther is generally going to agree. The only thing they're not going to agree on is evolution, which will be next week's class. We're going to talk about evolution. But generally, as far as like dating of the universe, dating of the Earth, and Old Earth Creationists goes, the evidence is overwhelming. We're not really going to argue that. And they really think it's more of our interpretation of Genesis that might be flawed. So that's kind of where. So last week we were talking about Young Earth Creationism, and then if there's any confusion, if there's like a key thing that I talk about today that you're a little confused on, maybe because you weren't here last week, just feel free to let me know, and I can clarify. So how do scientists estimate the age of the Earth, right? So they don't always provide an absolute age, meaning like that the Earth is definitely 4.5 billion years old, right? That's a number that's thrown out there sometimes based on certain dating mechanisms or techniques that we have. But they do provide at least a minimum age, right? So think of it like if someone were to find my clothes, right? They would say that I'm at least 16 or 17 years old because of my size, right? So they can look at my clothes and just kind of know that I'm a certain age. I'm not an infant, right? So there's no way an infant's wearing this size clothing, right? So you're going to see there's certain methods that they use where they can get a minimum age, and that'll kind of clarify itself as I go through the lesson. So the 6 methods that are used by science to date the Earth and the universe is, tree ring dating, ice core dating, varv dating, radiometric dating, distant starlight, and the expansion of the universe. And so let's just kind of dive right into this. So tree ring dating. So most of us are probably familiar with this concept of counting the rings of trees, right? And so you might be a little confused. Well, how are we going to? Trees don't live that long. I mean, the oldest one actually is 4,800 years old. So I was kind of surprised to find out just how old the oldest tree is based on this method of dating, right? So of course they couldn't chop down the tree, right, to get the stump. There's other ways that they kind of go into the tree, I guess, and they get some sort of estimate, and they found that it was Methuselah is the name of the tree. So it actually has biblical reference. Yes. But yeah, 4,800 years old is that tree. Yeah, kind of covered that.
Where is that tree?
That's a good question. I don't think it's around here. It could, but you want to know. I'm sure you could type in Methuselah. Yes, that is definitely. Can we go visit Methuselah? It sounds like something that would be like a. Yes. But the way that they do this is they go to these areas where these very, very old trees are, and they look at the old stumps, right, of dead trees as well as the living trees to kind of get an approximate age for how long they've been around for. And the date that they come up with is about 11,000 years old, based on that method of creating that timeline. So this creates a bit of a problem for young Earth creationists, because really the maximum that they can get to in terms of age is 10,000 years for the age of the universe, if we're only going by what Genesis tells us, right? If we interpret Genesis as 6 24-hour days, right, and then we use biblical genealogies to date the rest of it, we get to, biblical genealogies get us to about 4081 BC. And if we skip some generations here and there, which is thought that some of those generations are skipped, we can really just only get to a maximum of about 10,000 years. So if we're going to 11,000 years, they have to kind of account for where did that extra 1,000 years come from, or is there something wrong with the dating there? And so their response is threefold, right? So the first part is that trees can develop multiple rings in a year. So this has actually been observed, that it's not only one ring per year. Usually it is, but even if it's relatively infrequent, that would be enough to drive that 11,000 number below 10,000, right? If it's not, even if it's every couple years or every 5 years, over the course of that 10,000 years period, that would account for that extra 1,000 years. So that's that first point. Second point is that there's really no living trees older than the approximate flood date. So the way that they calculated that flood date using biblical genealogies was about 2458 BC, 2,500 years BC, 2,500 BC. And so I said Methuselah, oldest living tree, 4,800 BC. So that would actually go back to 2,800 BC if we're being very precise. But of course, there's that range because of those genealogies that may have been skipped. So they happen at approximately the same time, the flood and the oldest living tree. And so they say that that's kind of evidence that really nothing survived the flood, right? And the only reason that we have this tree today is that's alive is because it came after the flood. That's kind of just a bit of evidence that they provide. So interesting point. And then God may have created the trees with the rings already in place. So anyone familiar with the appearance of age theory? Is that okay? I'm not surprised. That's Paul probably.
If you think about even the Garden of Eden, did God create little tree saplings, or did He create forests of trees? I mean, it kind of makes sense.
Right. Right. I mean, the way that
if there was fruit to eat on the tree,
it had to have been a big enough tree.
Right. I mean, I think when I imagine creation in the Garden of Eden, I don't imagine it growing into the Garden of Eden. I imagine it created as that. Yeah. And so similar to Adam, right? So Adam didn't go from being an egg to a fetus to an infant to an adult human, right? So he was created, and at that same moment, he looked like he was, 25, 30 years old. He was an adult. Same thing with these trees, right? The rings were already there. They didn't grow there over time. They were just in place. So that's kind of and there's other ways that they apply the appearance of age theory to different other scientific methods, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. Any questions on that, tree ring dating?
Okay. The science of it too is what they have experienced. You can't, you can't go back in time and say, well, I see this now.
Right.
So I'm just going to apply that to everything, because it may not be the case.
When you're saying that, are you talking about
So let's just say, okay, I observed today that a ring is on a tree is formed every year.
Right.
But I know that just because I've seen that. But that doesn't mean that prior to me being alive, that 1,000 years ago they didn't grow two every year, right? Because the environment was different. And
That's
God
right.
allows science. He gives people the knowledge.
Right.
You don't know everything.
You don't. Yeah, it is kind of. There's a lot of hubris there when we think that everything was the same and we know everything.
Right. So I guess I'm of the perspective. I guess Young Earth, because I'm of the perspective it was just
10,000.
there.
Right.
And it was 10,000 years worth of rock formations.
Right. Right. Yeah. So that's what you want to try to form. I think that's what I'm kind of urging you to do is try to form that opinion. Which one you think fits best. I think there's really good arguments for both Young Earth and Old Earth Creationism. So what was I going to say? There was something else. So what you were kind of pointing out was, so scientists believe in this thing called uniformitarianism, right? Which is that everything was constant since the beginning of time, which really does go against our intuitions, because we know that there's all sorts of events where
that nothing is constant.
Nothing is constant. Right. I mean, hurricanes happen, volcanoes.
There's all sorts of things that don't fit the pattern.
That we can't explain.
That might usually be what happens
Right.
Just,
Yeah. So I think you were just kind of pointing that out, which is kind of crucial actually to the young Earth view, is that it's not uniform all the time. So let's kind of look at another one. So we have ice core dating. I had no idea what ice core dating was before I read this book. So it's counting the layers of ice using ice cores that are drilled from polar regions. And so that's kind of a little example of one. In fact, this one kind of shows you that's like the big ice core. Yeah, it sure does, although it's probably like negative 48 degrees. Yeah. but yeah, I think other than that, it's probably pretty fun. So what happens with with these ice layers is glaciers or these ice sheets will advance during the winter, right? So it gets much bigger during the winter time, and then it recedes during the summer, and you get this kind of layering effect from that advancement and recession. And so when you drill these ice cores, you're going to see these kind of various layers. And what you can do, because they happen on a somewhat regular basis, right? Again, though, we don't necessarily know exactly how regular that is. Kind of like Carolyn's point, we don't know how constant that was. How far does that go? Are there double layers created sometimes if it's kind of an odd season? Could be. But what happens is as these layers kind of get higher and higher and higher, the lower layers get compressed, right? And so the way they try to count them, the upper layers are very easy to count, right? Because they're not compressed. As you get further and further down, it kind of turns into a big jumbled mess of nothing, basically, that they have to try to estimate. What's that?
Mushed water.
Yeah, basically mushed hard water. And
That's a hard thing to calculate.
yeah, but they try to. I guess they look at the layering and how thick the layer is, and just based on how hard it's compressing it down, they try to come up with some number, which they come up with 800,000. And so they try to use this as another example of a minimum age for the Earth, right? So the Earth is at least 800,000 years old because these advancement recession cycles happen one per year. And even though we can't count those bottom layers because they're so compressed, we can estimate that there are however many number of them, and they come up with 800,000.
Meaning that there was no ice at the North Pole from the very beginning.
From the very beginning, right. That's a good point. So that's an assumption.
Come on.
Right. So
It's always cold out there.
it is always, yes. That's
So then therefore, all of those animals that are adapted to living in cold conditions before they lived in a forest.
Wait, say that again?
Uh-huh.
So all of those, like penguins, well, I don't know what lives in the world.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's polar bears. Yeah, polar bears are up there.
I guess in effect, if all the ice built up from
If there was no ice.
Uh-huh.
yes, then all of those animals supposedly just either appeared or
Yeah, I get.
adapted to negative. So many
I mean, they would probably argue for evolution is where they're going to go with that. They're going to say that they were, yeah. So, but no, it's.
Ice core dating would have to be, that's even more guesswork than tree dating.
Yes.
What's he done with slush?
Now they have an explanation for this. So let's kind of look at the Young Earth view.
Don't forget global warming.
I was
Because
just
that
gonna
melts
say
it away,
that.
so then you have to add extra to it.
Well, you might have some missing layers there then because of that, right?
So you
So.
just have to add in like an extra 100,000 to kind of compensate.
Yeah. Yes, I'm sure there's quite a bit of guesswork going on with this one, especially once you start going so far back. If you're talking about like hundreds of thousands of years, you can imagine your margin of error with that. Even if you're just a little wrong, I mean, you could literally be hundreds, if not thousands, of layers off.
This distance is not 100 years, it really is only 3. You're going to make
Some significant, miscalculations. So the way that the Young Earthers actually respond to this is that they actually look to the last ice age, right, which was about 2250 BC by geological models. And what's kind of thought that with this, so this would have been about 200 years approximately after the flood. And so there's this phenomenon that they refer to called a post-flood rapid ice age that would have happened. Now, 200 years doesn't sound like, it sounds like a longer period of time, but in geological terms, that's pretty fast. So there would have been these thick sheets of ice that would have been created because of that post-flood rapid ice age, which actually, they say that bottom layer, that compressed ice, is not actually compressed ice, it's that thick sheet from that initial freezing period after the flood. So that's kind of the Young Earth explanation of that. Which is interesting. So that ice age lasted for about 700 years, apparently, scientifically. So that's their response to that. Any questions on ice core dating? Okay. Varv dating. So I had no idea what a varv was. But they are these layers observed at the bottom of some lakes. So, and what they are layers of sediment that settles in brackish fresh water. So you're not going to see it in like a saltwater, environment, because it would kind of stain the rock in a different way. You wouldn't get these striations in the rock. But with fresh brackish water, where the sediment settles, and it does settle on a pretty regular basis. It's like once every winter, I think, something like that.
Is this like how they date the Grand Canyon? Is this that kind of thing? Looking at the sediment in the rock?
I don't think so. They didn't refer to that here.
It's like under the water.
It's under lakes.
They would like go down and then drill into the dirt under the water.
Yes, that's right. That's my understanding of it. If you want to know more about any of these, because like this is just a very cursory review of all these, and Young Earthers, like if you type in like creation science varvs, you'll likely get like a good Young Earth article about that, accounting for what it is. But in some areas, namely, I think the one that was the most significant was the Green River Geologic Formation. I think it's in North America, if you ask me that question. Yeah.
By the way, the trees in California.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Very big trees out there.
I just thought you should all know.
Thank you. But they've counted up to 6 million varvs. Okay, so that would again provide a minimum date of 6 million years for the Earth if we're going by that. But they kind of use the same response. Don't ask me about the science of it because I don't really know it, but they use the same post-flood rapid ice age to account for those multiple varv layers. They say that in that event where we have a post-flood rapid ice age, it's going to create multiple layers, and it's not necessarily just by one per year. Any questions on varv layers? Cool.
Wyoming, Utah, Colorado.
Geologic river formation?
Yep.
Thank you. Great. And then, no, it's great. And then we have radiometric dating. So this is definitely the most popular, means of dating that we have, especially for the Earth, because this one actually does. Well, they say that it provides more of an absolute age, a definite age for the Earth or for life. That's how they found out that the meteor hit the Earth 65 million years ago, and that's when dinosaurs disappeared. That's where they get that number from, is from radiometric dating. So, and this dates some rocks to 4.5 billion years old. That's kind of been the oldest rock found, and that's where they get the age of the Earth being 4.5 billion years. Now, I went all chemistry on you. Any chemistry people in here? Any people that are like into that sort of thing? Yeah? Nose means no. Got it. Okay, so let's, because I had no idea what an isotope was when I read the book. So I had to go back to 11th grade and try to remember what it was. And so isotopes, actually, let's kind of like pretend we're looking at a periodic table of elements. So element number one is hydrogen, right? And the reason why it's element number one is because it has one proton, right? And then it's an atom, it's called a stable atom when it also has one neutron. That makes sense? One proton, one neutron, you got a hydrogen atom. So now, hypothetically, if you then had two neutrons and one proton, well, it's still hydrogen, but it's no longer a stable hydrogen atom. It is now an unstable hydrogen isotope, okay? And then what happens is this isotope will then try to seek stability, and it's going to decay, right? Interestingly enough, it will decay into something that's not hydrogen, which is kind of a cool fact. And so what's going on with these rocks is they're starting out as an isotope called uranium-235, right? That's the unstable isotope. It has more neutrons than it has protons, and it will decay into what's called lead-207, so an entirely different element. But it will have the same number of protons and neutrons, and it takes a very, very long time for that process to complete. And they say that using this process, they can account for how long it's been going on for, and they say it's been going on for 4.5 billion years. Now, a young earther is going to have certain questions for that type of dating. And these are the three assumptions that they say are made by those who subscribe to radiometric dating. First one is that the initial conditions of the rock are known, which is a fair point. If we don't know what the initial condition of that rock is, how do we know what we're shooting for?
Meaning, like, if we don't know that this particular rock was uranium, how do we know that?
Or at least that what percentage of it was uranium. Like, it might have had uranium, because it probably has some uranium in it today. But how do we know that it was, say, like 100% uranium? Like, if you don't know the exact chemical composition of the original state of the rock, how do you know what you're aiming for? It could be the original chemical composition of the rock could be very similar to what it is now, for all you know, right?
Maybe that's just how that rock has always been.
Could be, right. Now, they might be able to observe that it is decaying very slowly, but still, we don't know what that original state of the rock was, even if you can see it sort of decaying now. So that's kind of the first one. The second one the second point is it kind of pairs with the first one. So it says the amount of the original isotope, this is the assumption, the amount of the original isotope has not been changed by other processes. So when it was first formed, there wasn't some other chemical process that was going on with the rock that altered it, right? Kind of very quickly. Does that kind of make sense that it could have been altered? And then the last one is kind of what accounts for the original creation of the rock until now. And the assumption is, again, uniformitarianism, like Carolyn was talking about, that the decay rate has been constant the whole time. How do we know that? How do we know that there wasn't some other, it wasn't exposed to something that would then sped up the process or possibly even slowed down the process, or it's been fluctuating over time? We don't know. That belief hinges upon uniformitarianism, the belief that these laws are constant and that there's been no change to that decay process over time. So I think they're all kind of fair points. And just a tidbit of knowledge. They use it's a different element or a different isotope for fossils. So fossils are actually carbon-14, because we're carbon-based life forms, right? So it's carbon-14 is an isotope that then decays into nitrogen. So that's what they're looking at for dino bones, is kind of where that is. Any questions on radiometric dating and kind of? That one I thought had the strongest rebuttal, because I think really pointing out those assumptions is crucial, because they're not insignificant assumptions. So.
I remember with that, I had taken a class at Eastern, so this was 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But the class, it was a biology class, and we went through in detail all of this stuff. And I remember the one point that Young Earth Creationists bring up is that there have been many reports of sending a particular rock to different universities to date, and you get way different dates for the same exact thing. And that doesn't mean that happens all the time, but it's you know what I mean? What's going on here? What? Why are we not? We're all getting different kinds of dates on stuff. There's been a lot of instances of that happening.
Right.
Different, professionals in carbon dating and radiometric dating will date the exact same thing
Differently.
Very different ages. So
Yeah.
It's to say that you're absolutely wrong by thinking the Earth is young. It's well, okay, you can't say that.
Right, because you guys are already in disagreement.
Right, yeah. That was fascinating.
Yeah, that's actually funny that it's. I actually forgot to bring that up with the last one. So they've like you said, there's certain rocks that is now. Did they actually know the age of the rock, or did they all just kind of date them differently?
I don't remember.
You don't remember?
All I remember was seeing different instances of them. I'm assuming they probably did, or I don't know. Different pieces of the same exact rock.
Right.
They sent it to different universities to date,
and they got varying results. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Because that was something that she brought up in the book too. Was that they actually had volcanic rocks, which we do know the age of, right? If a volcano eruption happened at a certain time, well, we can say it's this many years old, and they were off. They made that same point. And so again, same thing with that margin of error. If you know this rock is 5 years old, and you're off by 3 years, and it's 8 years, well, okay, now if you're trying to go back thousands of years, that's going to add up a lot. So yeah, it's just 3 very significant assumptions with that. So distant starlight. So now we're moving on from how scientists date the Earth to how they date the universe. Okay, this is even more far-fetched in some ways, but okay. So it measures the age of a star based on its distance from Earth, and so there are some objective ways that they've been able to calculate how far away some of these stars are, which are billions of light years away. Now, just for context and what that really, just to kind of get an idea for the enormity of the universe, the sun is 93 million miles away from Earth. and it takes the light from the sun 8 minutes to get here, traveling at a speed of 186,000 miles per second. So that's 7 times around the Earth in 1 second. It takes 8 minutes to get here. So that's pretty far. That's pretty far. So obviously that's the closest star to us, if you want to define the sun that way. The second closest star to us, I think, is 8 light years away. So it takes light, 8 years traveling at a speed of 186,000 miles per second to get here. Now, some of the further stars away from us are billions of light years away. So it's just unfathomable how far that is. You can really marvel at God's creation, I think, when you contemplate how big that is. It's just, you can't even comprehend it. But anyway, so we know these stars are extremely far away, and that's an understatement. But how do young earthers account for that? Because if it's really that far away, it would take that light billions of years to get here, right? So how do they account for that? And the first response is back to appearance of age theory, right? Light beams could have already been created in place, right? So that beam didn't have to necessarily travel all that way. It was already made, intact, from that star all the way to here in the initial creation. So that's kind of the first one. Second one is time dilation. Anyone know about time dilation? Kind of a fun concept. It's really hard to understand because it's very counterintuitive, but apparently it's a scientific fact. So what's going on? I'll say the statement and then I'll kind of put it into an image. So a moving clock will tick slower than a clock that is at rest in an observer's reference frame. Okay, we're all sitting in this room, right? We all have the same reference frame. We're all not moving. We're all sitting down. Even Pastor Russ's class is in our reference frame. Someone that would not be in our reference frame is someone driving down the road. Down, I guess, Clay Road. And certainly someone that would not be in our reference frame is someone careening through space at thousands of miles an hour. So those are different reference frames. So we're still here, different reference frames going on around us. People that are outside of our reference frame, clocks in those reference frame will tick slower. So I've got a clock, just pretend I have a clock next to me. I've got a watch. And I'm just going to kind of tick out the seconds. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, I was trying to be exact in my seconds. But those were seconds in our reference frame. Now, if you have, let's just kind of be rather extreme. Let's say we have a clock traveling at the speed of light going through space, above us. Those seconds, instead of going by 1, 2, 3, are going to go by 1, 2, 3. Less seconds are passing by. Less time is going by as it travels through space. Meaning, if you were to come from a very far away place, it would take less time for you to get here because of time dilation.
I think I heard that actually just the other day.
Did you?
Somebody was saying at work about that when they when your cell phone time syncs up with a satellite in space, they actually have to do a calculated adjustment for that time because it's faster in space.
Right. Yeah, because
when it gets to you, it's a slower time here. So what you get on your phone is not the real time that's coming from the satellite. There's an adjustment that's done. I'm like, what?
It's really wild, but you can look it up. It's not, you can get really in the weeds with time dilation. Apparently not. Apparently not. That's at least that's what the young earthers are saying. It's just the assumption that these are billions of light years away, and because of that, that it must take billions of light years to get here. Billions.
Dilation is a generally accepted thing in science. I'm trying to think about my question's not very good.
Because apparently they're actually seeing it if they're having to adjust time.
I guess that's what I'm saying though. If that is a generally accepted thing, and it has to happen for my phone to tell the right time, whatever that means, right? Then why would they not adjust all of their other measurements and times because of that?
That's a good question. They might be making certain assumptions. They might be trying to account for it in some way. They might be,
That stuff's just beyond my realm.
When you're talking about billions of light years, how do how do you
versus
even
7 billion, does it really make a difference?
well, but how do you even do the math to say, well, okay, it's faster from here to there than from here to there than from like.
Right, I guess it
What is
depends
that
on
even
how
that
I
far
mean,
it
there's
is.
some
maybe-
distance that's so vast.
I'm sure there's a very complicated way to account for that, but I don't know. Yeah, can we even? I think it's probably assumptions that you have to make in order to do that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That could mean too that time is different at 20 billion light years away than it would be from 3 billion light years away.
Exactly.
Right.
We don't know that. Because
That's
they're here,
that's
not
kind of what I'm
there.
saying.
Yeah.
How do you know?
So this person may say this, and somebody else says, oh no, here's the adjusted calculation.
Yeah.
Yeah, the second is also based like going around the sun. Like, whether you measure,
Say that again.
you're also counting like the second came from, I'll say 1 day divided by 24 divided by 60 or however many. But our day isn't really 24 because like the moon's going slightly off. of-
Exactly.
Right.
So like, what is 1 second?
I guess that's Then you're really kind of
That's exactly right.
I've done my thinking for today.
Yes.
On a non-work day. That's
I mean,
but you're absolutely right.
Something that we've come up with to understand.
Right. Well, it's an arbitrary measurement. But it's dependent on our reference frame. Like because a second is different depending on your reference frame, and so. I guess exactly how you would account for that, depending on the distance and how. Well, I guess the speed you would be going is a calculated speed. It's 186,000 miles per second. But it's a good question as to why they didn't try to account for that already.
That's why I was curious if that was a widely accepted theory or if it was a theory that is still a work in practice.
I think it's.
It is a widely accepted
There's
theory.
a movie about
I think it comes from. I think it comes from special relativity. It's. Oh, you're talking about Back to the Future?
I like it too. I feel like this is one of those things where like I want to see what happened.
I'm the same way, but I'm like, because I'm like,
What's the
wait.
movie about the guy who like
Oh, Interstellar?
Interstellar? Yeah.
Okay, I haven't seen that since it came out. I saw it in theaters.
Yeah, I just recently saw that, and it's a movie, but it's really cool because it shows how he travels at the speed of light. He doesn't age.
Right.
But his daughter, who he left on Earth, once he finds his way back, I don't want to ruin it all, but once he makes the full trip, she is now older than him.
Yes, I forgot about that. It's
showing,
yeah. It shows time dilation actually.
Yes, that's.
Yeah, it
that's
kind of
what
exhibits
I-
time dilation. Yeah, and so I don't know if they just think that that when we see the light from these stars, since it looks like it's billions of years old, maybe it's even further away than we think, right? Because if it looks like it's billions of years old and they account for time dilation, maybe the assumption that's even further away, right? And what we're seeing is
It takes less time for
Right. So it's instead of let's just pick an arbitrary number. Say it looks like it's 1 billion light years away. It's more like 1 trillion light years away or something much further.
How does that work with like our time? Because say you're in your rocket ship traveling in space, their clock is still, and now we're the one moving compared to that.
Right. So from their perspective, if they're still, whatever it is, then it would. If we're the ones moving, then time would then slow down for us. And it gets really.
But I would like to come back to if this is why you can't believe what the Bible says is true, then you have other issues and you're just making this your case.
Yeah.
There's other things going on. This is not going to be the only thing that separates you from being I believe it.
Yeah, I think. Well, the reason why this
But I think this stuff, I think it's interesting, and these are wonderful conversations to get into with people who aren't believers because they'll go, well, this doesn't make sense.
Mhm.
And here's this one thing that I'm going to pick out. But
I think it's a very simplistic understanding because I don't know that most people when they say that distant starlight, for example, they know that certain things are billions of light years away, and so if they're billions of light years away, that must mean the universe is billions of years old at least, right? And they actually in our next slide we can just kind of move on to expansion of the universe because this one actually dates the age of the Earth, age of the universe.
Well, wouldn't it be simple? Maybe this is a simplistic approach, but the creation account that we're talking about is the creation account of our Earth.
And the universe. Heavens and the earth.
All of the universe?
I
Is it unreasonable to?
I mean, there might be an interpretation in which you could. I think young earthers actually purport that it's the whole universe. That's what they're saying, is that the whole creation, was initiated 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. But at least that's the way I understand young Earth creationism. But yeah. But anyway, I think the reason why, something like distant starlight, where to us it kind of seems like, well, why are we talking about this? It's like, it's kind of like an issue with Genesis, but doesn't really have any impact on the gospel. For them, they see it as undermining our scriptures, right? It undermines the Bible, and therefore it's not reliable, and that's kind of where they're going with that. Yeah, because if the Earth is actually being
not right about this, it's not right about
other things, that's kind of the approach that they're taking. So, expansion of the universe. So, I believe it was Edwin Hubble that discovered that the universe has been expanding based on observances made from the Hubble Space Telescope, and they've actually calculated that rate of expansion. I don't know the exact rate of expansion, but it is expanding. In case Dan or Jake want to know, there probably is an equation that they can. Using this expansion theory and just kind of, because I guess it is calculable, so they've actually figured out that it is expanding at a certain rate. They then reverse that process to take it down to a single point. Some of you might have heard of it, the term is singularity, right? So that's what the universe supposedly burst out from, was a single little piece of matter that just had all this potential, then it exploded into existence. And with this reversal, they've dated the universe to 13.8 billion years old, right? So that's kind of how they did that. So Young Earth response to that is that the Bible suggests that God stretched out the heavens, right? So this was not, again, a uniform thing. This wasn't something that was constantly expanding at the same rate the whole time. Isaiah 9:8 says that he alone stretches out the heavens. So in the beginning, boom, he stretches it out over the course of potentially a single day. At least that's what a Young Earther is going to say. So it hasn't been expanding at the same rate, and the Bible actually supports that with certain verses, right? So again, it just assumes uniformitarianism when they're saying that it's just been expanding at this exact same rate the whole time. And then you do get into certain issues of when it getting down to that singularity, and like, well, what caused it to explode? Why was it there? There's other philosophical issues that you run into with that.
I also have a question about that.
Mhm.
Think about a couple hundred years ago, we thought Earth was the center of the solar system.
Right.
Everything went around it. But now we're saying that from Earth, looking at the stars, we can see that everything is expanding away from us. Like, everything is going away from our perspective of what we see.
I don't know that we're the center.
But I'm just saying,
okay.
from our reference point
Right.
of Earth,
Mhm.
we can see that things are moving directly away from us. And I don't know, that just doesn't quite make sense to me, that you can sit here on Earth and know that we're not even the center of the galaxy, but say that it's all expanding away from us. Like,
Yeah, I'm sure there's some nitty-gritty details in there that I wish I was an astrophysicist right now, because I feel like I could help you out, but I'm not.
that's the kind of question I have for somebody like that. Well, I can see these calculations.
Yeah, I mean,
It's expanding versus the stars are just moving.
Yeah, like the whole thing is just.
yeah, I know. Well, I know that there's certain telescopes that are even stronger than the Hubble Space Telescope now that can see very, very far, apparently, into space. And my guess is that they have certain anchor points that they're using to, try to see, like, is it expanding? I don't know exactly how they do it, but they probably have some sort of explanation for it that's just like way beyond my pedigree. But yeah, it's apparently it's a scientific fact. It's actually not one that young earthers will contend. That's one that they will concede. Now, what's important to know is that old earthers, so I've been kind of giving the young earth response to all this. Old earthers will agree with science, right? So, depending on where you are, it's my conviction that your position on this, old earth, young earth, is not going to impact your understanding of the gospel. It's not going to impact your salvation. It's not going to impact anything like that, right? They're just two different perspectives on a segment of the Bible that while it's good to know, that the creation account, it has nothing to do really with your sin forgiveness or eternal salvation through Jesus. So here's Old Earth Creationism. So some of you might find this to be more appealing. So it's the belief that the depth of scientific evidence for an Old Earth is sufficient, right? And the key points to make the biblical case for Old Earth Creationism is that the most obvious reading of the Bible is not always the right reading, right? So there's a verse that we're actually going to look at. Pastor Paul actually talked about it a few weeks ago, maybe months ago at this point, which they use as kind of like an example of us kind of looking at Scripture, and we can really draw the wrong conclusions from it if we're just looking at the most obvious reading. Secondly, we have the Bible indicates that the 6 days of creation were not 24-hour days. So they're going to make the case that there's biblical evidence that it's not 24-hour days. And we'll kind of look at that. And then accepting an Old Earth theory poses no threat to the gospel, right? So that's kind of their last final point. They kind of are going to rebut that idea that the existence of potential sin, or not even really sin, or animal death before Adam sinned, kind of undermines the gospel. That's kind of their big case that they make, or that Young Earthers make to say that Old Earth Creationism causes gospel problems. So the most obvious reading is not always the right reading. And this is the one that we're going to look at today, right? So there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. What is the most obvious reading of that? So actually, just some context. So Jesus here is talking to his disciples, right? And he's saying that, that there are some standing here in my presence that will not die, that will not taste death, before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So what does that seem to say?
That Jesus is coming back in like 3 weeks.
Yes, right. That his second coming is happening very quickly, right? Within the lives.
Within their lifetime.
Yeah, within their lifetime.
That's what I actually.
Yeah. So I mean, and that might have been what the disciples understood at that time. Now, of course, we know in the fullness of time that he did not come back in the 1st century, or even the 2nd century, or even in the 19th century, or 20th century. Right? He hasn't come back yet. So what could this possibly mean? Anyone know, how scholars interpret this passage?
Was this before or after the resurrection?
Before.
Okay. So could the resurrection be?
Yeah.
That's one. That's one of them.
Is this second coming really the third coming?
Yeah, well, depending on which way you look at it, it could be the 4th, actually. So, yeah. Because there's another one, too, that scholars would point to. Anyone know the other one? Paul actually talked about it a couple months ago, which was the Transfiguration. So that's only a couple verses after this, actually, where we have the Transfiguration happening. Jesus hanging out with Moses and Elijah, and then we have God, saying, "This is my son, in whom I'm well pleased." So there's this kind of epic moment where he's being revealed in his glory in the form of the Transfiguration. So to Peter, John, and James. So that's another way that he could have been coming in his kingdom. There's other ways to look at that. Another way that some people look at it, and I don't really agree with it necessarily, but they'll look at the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So that would have been within the lives of the apostles, or some of them anyway, and other disciples that would have been alive at that time, not even just the apostles. And that would have been it's perceived by some scholars as like a time of judgment where Jesus essentially returned in a manner of speaking, not even if it wasn't in his.
I think that's a stretch.
I do too. I don't think that was necessarily. I think they're overthinking. Even though it was a major incident, in the course of history, but I don't think it's that incident. So the most common two views on the origin of creation for an Old Earther are the day-age theory and the framework theory. And so the day-age theory is that each day is an age. When we look into creation, that each day through 1 through 6, we're all, ages, not necessarily days, right? And they kind of have evidence that they give for that. Now, what a day-age theorist is going to say is that the order was still correct, right? So he creates the heavens and the earth, and then there's the firmament, right? The sky, and then you have I think vegetation, separation of land from water, and then vegetation, and then the starry host. That one I always thought was weird, how the sun, moon, and stars came so late in the creation process. Because that's on day 4, and then day 5, I believe you have animal life, water life. I'm messing it up. But finally you get day 6, where you have, I believe, land animals and humans. So the ordering was correct. That's kind of the bottom line with the day-age theory. And then the framework theory takes a more loose approach, right? So it looks at Genesis not necessarily as to be taken literally in any fashion. It's really just kind of poetic, right? And that's kind of their take on Genesis, that it's kind of similar to Psalms, where we're not supposed to, it's more metaphorical, it's not necessarily something to be taken with rigid, any kind of rigid structure. So it's kind of, any questions on those? Comments? No, we're good? Cool. All right, maybe a couple more, maybe one more slide. So the Bible indicates that the 6 days of creation were not 24-hour days. So what's their evidence for that? Because it seems, and I think I said this in the last class, the most obvious reading of Genesis is that they were 6 24-hour days, right? It says day, which to us, a day is a 24-hour period. So a day in Hebrew, which the word for that is yom, is not necessarily 24-hour days. Other words English words that we can use to mean day in Hebrew. Daylight is another time that it's used in that way sometimes in the Bible. It's also used, it's kind of like an indefinite period of time, like a day of the Lord, right? Which is kind of similar to when we say like back in the day, right? We're not really referring to a specific day. We're referring to kind of a time in the past that's kind of ambiguous. But it was in the past. So there's other ways that yom is used in the Hebrew Bible. So, and then kind of like I said earlier, I find it's very interesting that the sun, moon, and stars were not created until day 4, which means interesting things for a day, right? Because especially back then, they didn't have clocks. What is a day without the sun or even the stars, right? Those were ways that they measured time back then. And this I think is one of the stronger pieces of evidence for Old Earth Creationism is this: what was day 1 through 3? If we don't have a sun, moon, or stars. Now, there actually is a pretty good rebuttal for that, though, which, anyone know? So, what creates the 24-hour cycle? It's rotation. It's not dependent on the sun. Yes, the sun participates in that, right? Because there's a source of light, which we are rotating. But if that source of light comes from something else, like in Revelation, it talks about, God being the light, right? So, there's not going to be a sun in the new heaven, right? It's that light is just going to essentially emanate from God, and that's going to be the new heaven. So similar to that, in the beginning, it talks about there being light. We just don't know exactly what the source of it was. As long as it's not like an all-encompassing light where there's light in every direction, you would still have the effect of a 24-hour cycle. So a young earther can kind of say that, but it doesn't really say it. It doesn't really specify exactly what the nature of the light was. And I think the concept of there not being a sun, which really does create, those sunrises and sunsets, was really kind of where we get the idea of a day from, especially in the absence of clocks. It's an interesting point. Bible also suggests that the Sabbath day is ongoing. There's actually some certain verses, Hebrews 4, let's bring it up. Hebrews 4:4-7 says, "On the 7th day God rested from all his works," and then a little bit later it says, "Therefore, since it still remains for some to enter that rest," the implication being that we can still enter the rest of God's Sabbath. That God's Sabbath is still happening today, right? And that's kind of what Hebrews 4 seems to be saying. And actually, God's still at work in our lives, right? So some people might say that, like, he can't be resting, because he's doing stuff. I mean, he's performed miracles through Jesus, on earth. So he couldn't have been resting at that time. And actually, John 5:16-18, I think, is where Jesus actually calls out the Pharisees in that, because they were accusing him of performing miracles on Saturday, on the Sabbath. And he says, my Father isn't resting, and it's his Sabbath. I'm gonna do good things on the Sabbath too. And so just because it's the Sabbath doesn't mean that God isn't working and doing good things. But yeah, this is also kind of another stronger element to their case. The idea of the Sabbath being ongoing. Why would the Sabbath continue on and on and on and on, but the other ones would not be, why would they be confined to a 24-hour period? So, and then we have, this one I don't think is the best case, but an unreasonable amount of activity on day 6 for one 24-hour day. And what they're really talking...
It's unreasonable for God.
Right, it's too much work. That's right. Yes, that's why he's still resting today. Yeah, that's why it's taking so long. What they're really referring to here is Adam, for him to name all the animals. That's why I have a picture of all those animals up there. Yeah. But I still think there's some assumptions being made about Adam too. You got to figure this is before the fall. We don't know what Adam was like.
His capabilities had to be fantastic.
Yeah.
Right? Did he get tired?
The image of God, so
Like, I feel like Adam was capable of getting a lot more done in the day than I.
Then you or I were, right, or are. So yeah, could he have? Because the number that they've approximated is like 2,500 different kinds of animals, which is like, I guess, a little less than 2 per minute, something like that. That he would have to name if he didn't sleep, if he didn't eat, if he didn't use the bathroom, all those kinds of things. Like if he didn't have to ever take a break, he would have to do approximately a little less than 2 per minute. So.
Comedian I like that does, like, when he gets to the end, he's like, that's why we have things named like fly and grasshopper. Because it's getting-
Yeah, that's funny.
He got big words like the hippopotamus at the beginning.
That's really funny.
There's a comedian I heard did a funny, I thought it.
That's great, yeah. But anyway, they try to make the case that it's just too much activity. I'm like, maybe, I don't know. And then lastly, the Sabbath rests were in years as well as days, which it's interesting to know. There's different kinds of Sabbaths, right? We have the usual Sabbath, which is Saturday, which is a 24-hour period, which is supposed to rest from doing all your work from the week. But there were also Sabbath years for the land, right? You rested your land every 7 years, and you didn't till it, you didn't sow, you just kind of let the land rest. And there was also Jubilee, right? Happened every 7 sevens. Every 49 years, you would have a forgiveness of debts. And, so there's all these different kinds of patterns of Sabbaths going on. And so Old Earthers will kind of say, well, how do we know this wasn't like a different kind of pattern? Well, this was more like a God day as opposed to, a human day per se. And of course, a Young Earther is going to say, well, it doesn't say God day, it says just day. So I think we're making assumptions if we're then extrapolating that it was something else. When I was doing this, though, this isn't in the book, I thought about this. I'm like, isn't there a verse about that? 2 Peter 3:8 says this: with the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. So it's actually scriptural to say that God days are actually quite longer than a human day here. So, and whether that 1,000 years necessarily means a precise 1,000 years or just a very long period of time is a matter of interpretation. So could we look at these initial days of creation as God days and not human days? It's just something interesting to think about. But